My name is Nadia Colm, and I turned 18 on a Thursday in April. The night before my birthday, I drove 30 minutes out of town on a road I've known since I could see out of a car window, parked in the grass beside the old mailbox, and sat on the porch of my grandfather's farmhouse, watching the orchard in the dark. At midnight, I opened my laptop, signed a single document, and sent it to a woman named Claire Moreau. By 8 the next morning, Claire was standing at the County Land Records Office with a certified copy of an irrevocable trust that my grandfather had established 6 years before he died. My uncle had signed a preliminary agreement with a residential developer 3 weeks earlier for a property he had never owned. He found this out at 8:47 that morning, when the clerk at the records counter typed in the parcel number and the screen told a different story than the one he'd been telling himself. My father was standing beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. I know this because Claire was there, sitting in the waiting area with her coffee, watching the door. She'd come early on purpose. I want to tell you how this happened and why, and what it cost. But I need to start in the right place, which is not the trust document, or the developer, or the birthday. It starts with an orchard in September, and a man who understood that the most important things you can leave someone are not always the things you hand them directly. My grandfather, Bernard Colm, bought the Aldenvale property when he was 32 years old, with money saved across 8 years of working construction and a loan from the credit union that he paid off in 11 years ahead of schedule because he was that kind of person. 42 acres on a gentle slope outside the town of Harwick, with a farmhouse that needed significant work, and an apple orchard of 60 trees that had been planted 30 years before he arrived, and that he spent the next 4 decades learning to read the way some people read books. Bernard was not an educated man in the formal sense. He left school at 16 to help support his mother and 2 younger siblings after his father's death, and the gap this left in his credentials was something he encountered throughout his working life, in ways that quietly infuriated him. What he had instead was the specific intelligence of someone who pays close attention to physical things, to soil and weather, and the particular character of each tree in his orchard, which varieties bore early and which bore late, which needed more water in dry summers, which ones his wife Edith preferred for her pies, and which ones he preferred eating straight off the branch while walking the rows on an October morning. Bernard and Edith had 2 sons. Dennis, my father, was the elder. Raymond, my uncle, came 3 years later. Neither of them, as far as I could observe across the years of my childhood, had any particular feeling for the farm beyond its presence as a place where family gatherings were occasionally held, and where, therefore, they were occasionally obliged to appear. Dennis had moved to Hartwick proper before I was born, where he ran a mid-sized plumbing supplies company that he'd built from a small operation he'd bought with some help from Bernard. Raymond lived 40 minutes away in Kenner and worked in commercial insurance with what seemed to me, even as a child, to be more enthusiasm for the concept of making money than for the actual work of it. They were not bad men, my father and my uncle, but they were men who had grown up watching their father pour his life into a piece of land, and who had concluded, separately and apparently without discussion, that this was not what they wanted, and who had then, in the particular way of people who have made such a conclusion, gradually stopped being able to see what was actually there. I am the only child of Dennis and Karen Colm. I grew up in Hartwick, in a house that was comfortable and organised, and in which I was fed and clothed and educated, and where birthdays were remembered and school achievements were noted. I want to be fair to my parents because fairness is the thing I'm trying to hold on to most carefully in the telling of this story. And fairness requires me to say that they were not people who ignored me or wished me harm. They were people whose idea of love expressed itself primarily through provision, and whose attention ran along certain channels: school performance, social development, the visible markers of a child progressing in the expected directions. I was not unhappy at home. I was also not, in any room of our Hartwick house, as fully myself as I was at Aldenvale. I started spending summers at the farm when I was 9. This was primarily Bernard's doing. He called my father and suggested it one spring, and my father agreed with the efficiency of someone who has just been offered a solution to a logistical problem they hadn't quite articulated. My parents both worked full days through the summer, and the question of what I did with those days had a weight that I sensed without fully understanding. Bernard drove into Hartwick on the first Friday of June that year in his green pickup truck with the cracked passenger window he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. And I got in with a bag that was too large for 1 week, but turned out to be exactly right. And he drove us out to Aldenvale on roads I didn't yet know, but that would become, over the following years, as familiar to me as my own name. I need you to understand what those summers were, because everything else in this story grows from them. Bernard was not a man who explained himself much. He showed you things and then watched to see what you did with them, and he adjusted what he showed you next based on what he observed. That first summer, he showed me the orchard in the way you show a child a new language. Not through instruction, but through immersion, through presence, through the slow accumulation of specific knowledge that eventually tips from strangeness into fluency. He showed me how to thin the fruit in July so the remaining apples would grow to their full size. He showed me how to read the color of a leaf to understand what the tree needed. He showed me which of the older trees had quirks that required accommodation. The bramley in the northwest corner that produced magnificently every other year and sulked in between. The 2 coxes near the lower fence that needed extra attention to drainage. The ancient russet at the top of the slope that Bernard called the old man, and that he treated with the deference you'd give an elder who has earned the right to be difficult. Edith was there through those summers, in the way that the house itself was there. Present, essential, the organizing center of everything. She was a woman with a precise mind and a generous heart, which is a combination that produces a particular kind of wisdom, the wisdom of someone who understands both how things work and why they matter. She kept the house with the same attention Bernard kept the orchard, and she kept the accounts and managed the correspondence and maintained the relationships with the other farms in the area and the local agricultural cooperative and the markets where they sold their apples each autumn. She also kept a sharp eye on the people around her, and what she saw she remembered and never wasted. She made me iced tea in the afternoons and let me sit beside her on the porch and didn't require me to fill the quiet with conversation, which was one of the most valuable gifts anyone has ever given me. When I was 11, Bernard took me to the top of the slope one morning before the heat set in, and we sat on the old stone wall that marked the orchard's upper boundary and looked out over the 42 acres below us, the rows of trees and the farmhouse and the smaller outbuildings and the meadow beyond. And Bernard said something I carried with me for 7 years before I fully understood what he meant by it. He said that a piece of land doesn't belong to the person who holds the deed. It belongs to the person who holds the knowledge of it. He said a deed is a piece of paper, and paper is temporary. But what you learn from a place lives in you, and nobody can take it back once it's there. He was looking at the orchard when he said it, not at me, which is how Bernard said the things that mattered most. Sideways, aimed at the space between you rather than directly at your face. I know now that when Bernard said this, he had already been speaking to Claire Morhol for several months. I know that he had already told her what he wanted, what he was worried about, and what he needed to put in place before it was too late. He was 69 that summer. He was healthy, but he was the kind of man who had watched enough things fail to understand that health is temporary and planning is not. He had spent 40 years building something he loved, and he had sons who would sell it without hesitation, and he had a granddaughter who came back every summer and asked where the water went when the creek was low, and whether the old man russet would fruit again this year, and what happened to the soil under the apple trees that made it smell different from the meadow grass. He had made up his mind about something. He just needed time to do it properly. I don't want to make my father sound like a villain, because that's not the right word for him. Dennis was a man shaped by a particular kind of ambition. The ambition of someone who grew up watching his parents work very hard for a modest result, and who concluded from this that the result was the problem rather than the ambition itself. He had built something real with his plumbing supplies business, and I respect that. What he had also built, without intending to and without noticing he was building it, was a way of seeing everything through the lens of what it could become if converted to something more financially efficient. The farm was 42 acres of land that sat on the southwest edge of Hartwick, which had been growing steadily outward for a decade. Dennis was not stupid. He could see what was around the farm, and he could see what was coming. And he had been doing arithmetic in his head for years that produced a number that interested him considerably more than apples. Raymond was simpler in his motivations and less careful in his methods. Raymond was the kind of man who arrived at the right conclusion: sell the farm, get the money, by the wrong reasoning, which was that the land was sitting there doing nothing useful when it could be turned into capital that could be deployed in other ways. This is the way of people who understand money as a concept better than they understand things. And Raymond's understanding of things had always been more limited than his understanding of concepts. He had also, as I would discover, moved considerably faster than Dennis, and with considerably less concern for the legal details, which was consistent with his general approach to the world. Bernard died when I was 15. It was a November, cold and overcast, and I had not seen him since August because school had started and the farm was 2 hours each way on the bus, and my parents had not offered to drive me. I did not know this absence would be the last. The stroke was quick, as strokes sometimes mercifully are, and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. Edith called my father, and my father told me, and I sat in my bedroom and looked out at the street where the leaves were coming down in the wind, and felt the particular quality of grief that comes when you understand that something you expected to have more time with is simply gone. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Grey sky, cold wind off the fields, the smell of turned earth from the neighbouring farm that Bernard had sold a section of meadow to 15 years earlier to fund a roof repair he refused to take a loan for. I sat with Edith in the second pew and held her hand through the service. My father and Raymond sat together in the front pew, and even from behind I could see the particular quality of their stillness, which was not the stillness of grief, but the stillness of men in the presence of a situation that is about to require decisions. At the gathering afterward, held at the farm itself because Edith had insisted, I stood near the kitchen doorway with a plate of food I wasn't eating, and watched my father and uncle on the far side of the room in a conversation that was quieter than the one around them. Raymond had a piece of paper in his jacket pocket. I saw the corner of it when he reached for his glass. I didn't know what the paper was. I was 15. I noted it and filed it away with the instinct that children raised in quiet households develop for the things that are meant to be unseen. In the weeks after Bernard's funeral, I spent 2 weekends at Aldenvale with Edith, helping with the things that accumulate when someone is grieving and the ordinary maintenance of life becomes difficult to sustain. I raked the last of the fallen leaves from the orchard floor, as Bernard had taught me, because leaves left to mat over winter create conditions for rot. I stacked the firewood that Bernard had cut in October and never finished stacking. Edith and I cooked together and talked about Bernard, and about the orchard, and about what needed doing before the snow came. She was diminished by his loss in a way that was visible but also, I thought, temporary. She had the deep constitution of someone who has survived many things, and expected to survive this, too. I believed I was right about this. I was wrong. Edith became ill the following spring. Not dramatically, not with the sudden rupture of Bernard's stroke, but quietly and progressively. The kind of illness that takes up residence and rearranges things. And by the following January, she was gone. She was 74. I was 16. The 2 funerals in 14 months left a gap in the center of my life that I did not know how to describe to anyone, including myself, for a long time. After Edith's funeral, which was smaller than Bernard's and held at the church rather than the farm, because my father had arranged it, and my father found the farm impractical for gatherings, I noticed a different quality in the conversations around me. People handling the logistics of a death always have a slightly abstracted air, a focused practicality that coexists with grief, and that I had learned to recognize. But what I noticed in the car on the way home, listening to my father and mother talk in the front seat while I sat in the back looking at the passing fields, was something with a different quality. A quality of relief that had nothing to do with the particular mercy of Edith's death, and everything to do with what her death meant the door was now open for. My mother, to her credit, was uncomfortable. I could hear it in the silences she put between my father's sentences. My father was not uncomfortable. He was already organizing, the way he organized everything, methodically and forward-looking, and with the particular confidence of a man who has decided what he wants and is now simply working through the steps required to get there. The farm came up at dinner 2 weeks later. Not as a question, not as a discussion, but as a presentation, which is how my father raised the subjects he had already decided. He said that with both grandparents gone, Aldenvale needed to be handled responsibly. He said the property taxes were substantial and that maintaining the orchard required labor and equipment that neither he nor Raymond had any interest in sustaining. He said a developer he knew from a business association had expressed serious interest in the property and that the numbers were, he paused here with the particular pause of someone who wants you to appreciate what they're about to say, significant. He looked at me when he said it, not unkindly, looking to see if I understood. Grandpa always talked about keeping it in the family, I said. I was trying to keep my voice even and mostly succeeding. My father's expression had the patience of someone explaining a practical reality to someone who hasn't yet learned to be practical. He said that was a nice idea, but that sentiment wasn't a management strategy, and that the farm had been a passion project for his parents, and that there was no shame in converting a passion project into capital that could benefit everyone. He used the phrase, benefit everyone. I thought about Raymond on the far side of the room at Bernard's funeral, with a piece of paper in his jacket pocket. I said I'd like to think about it. My father said there wasn't that much to think about, but that he appreciated my being reasonable. I went upstairs after dinner and sat on my bed and thought about the specific sentence Bernard had said on the stone wall when I was 11, that a deed is a piece of paper, and paper is temporary, but what you learn from a place lives in you. I thought about the way he'd looked at the orchard when he said it. I thought about what he'd known about his sons and what he might have done about what he knew. The following Saturday, I drove to Aldenvale alone. This was the autumn of my 16th year, and I had my license and the use of the family's second car on weekends, which my parents had agreed to without enthusiasm. The farm had been locked since Edith's death, and the key I had, the one Bernard had given me when I was 12, for emergencies, he'd said, with a small private smile I hadn't understood at the time, still worked in the back door. The house smelled like Edith, like the particular mixture of lavender and old wood, and the specific variety of apple that she kept in a bowl on the kitchen table through the autumn. The bowl was still there, the last 3 apples shrunken and soft now, and I stood in the kitchen for a long moment before I could move. I walked through the rooms the way you walk through a place when you're saying something that doesn't have words yet, slowly and with attention. The orchard was visible from the back bedroom window. The rows of trees were bare in November, and I could see the stone wall at the top of the slope where Bernard and I had sat, and the old man russet at the far end of the upper row, already leafless and patient in the way it was always patient, already preparing for the spring that was months away. In the study, the small room off the hallway that Bernard had used as an office, I went through the desk drawer, looking for nothing specific, just looking, in the way you look when you are hoping a place will give you something but don't know what. In the back of the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old seed catalogues, was a sealed envelope, my name on the front. Edith's handwriting. Her letters had a very particular quality, a precision that she had developed in her years as a bookkeeper. A hand that was both beautiful and legible in a way that seemed almost unfashionable, like a skill from an earlier era that had been maintained through discipline. I sat down on the floor of Bernard's study and opened it. Inside was a business card, a woman's name, Claire Moreau, with the words estate law and trust administration beneath it, and a phone number and address in Hartwick. On the back, in Edith's handwriting, 3 sentences. She had pressed hard with her pen, as she always did when she meant something to be permanent. It said, "Your grandfather built something worth keeping. He made sure it could be kept. Call this number when you are ready and not before." I sat on the floor of the study for a long time with the card in my hand. I did not call the number that day. Edith had said when I was ready and not before, and I understood, with a precision I couldn't have explained, that this meant something about timing, that there was a right moment, and that I would know it, and that acting before it came would be a different kind of mistake than acting after it. I put the card in my wallet, behind my student ID, where it stayed for 7 months. During those 7 months, I went to Aldenvale every weekend that I could arrange without raising questions. I kept the farmhouse aired and maintained. I checked the orchard through the winter, noting which trees had survived the cold well and which were showing signs of stress, the specific vocabulary of the trees that Bernard had spent a summer teaching me, and that had become second nature. I cut back the water shoots in February, something Bernard had always done himself, and that I had watched every year until I could do it with my eyes closed. I was not protecting the farm against a specific threat yet. I was keeping a promise I had made to myself on the stone wall when I was 11, when I had decided that this was a place that would be mine to care for, if it was mine to care for at all. At home, the conversations about Aldenvale continued at a frequency that increased as winter became spring. Raymond began appearing at our house for Sunday dinners with a regularity that was new and that I tracked without comment. He and my father would disappear after dinner into my father's study, and I could hear the low register of their conversation through the wall of the sitting room where I did my homework. Not the words, but the tone, which was the tone of people conducting the middle stages of a plan. Raymond had a way of speaking about the farm when it came up in my presence that had shifted since the funerals. It was no longer Grandpa's place or even the farm. It was the property. And this single word change told me everything I needed to know about how far along the plan was. In March, 11 months after Edith's death, my father sat down with me at the kitchen table with the specific arrangement of his posture that meant he wanted a direct conversation. He said that he and Raymond had been in discussions with a developer called Harwick Green, and that the interest was serious and the numbers were strong, and that the timing was good because the planning environment in the area favoured residential development at the moment, and that kind of alignment didn't last. He said he wanted me to understand that this was not a decision being made without thinking about my grandparents, that they had loved the farm, and that selling it was not a rejection of that love, but an acknowledgement that it had served its purpose, and that purposes change. He said the proceeds would benefit everyone, and there was that phrase again. He looked at me with the same patient expression as before, the expression of someone waiting for understanding to arrive. I said I needed time to think. My father said he understood, but that time was actually somewhat limited, because these conversations had a natural momentum, and he didn't want to lose the window. I said I understood. I went upstairs. I took Claire Moreau's card out of my wallet. I was ready. Claire Moreau's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Charter Street in Hartwick, a small, orderly space with a view of the courthouse square and the kind of organised density that belongs to someone who handles a great deal of information and has developed very efficient systems for it. She was in her 50s, with close-cropped dark hair and the unhurried manner of someone who is precise rather than slow. Every word exactly chosen, every pause containing something. She had known I would come eventually, she said. She had expected it to be sooner. But she had also known, from what Bernard and Edith had told her, that I was patient. And patience is rarer than most virtues, and more useful than almost all of them. She opened a folder on the desk between us, and she walked me through what Bernard and Edith had done, clearly and sequentially, as though she understood that this information was going to rearrange several things simultaneously, and that the rearranging deserved to happen slowly enough to be absorbed. Bernard had established the Alden Vale Irrevocable Trust 6 years before his death, with Edith's full knowledge and participation. Funded initially with the property itself, and subsequently with 2 investment accounts that he had been carefully building since the early years of his marriage. The trust named Claire as trustee and me as sole beneficiary, with the trust's assets to be transferred to my control upon my turning 18 and completing the formal acceptance process. The cabin, the 42 acres, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, and the investment accounts. Total current value approximately $2.4 million, including the land's appreciated value, had been held in the trust for 6 years. They had not been part of Bernard's estate when he died. They had not been part of Edith's estate when she died. There was nothing for my father and uncle to inherit, because the assets they wanted to sell had been legally removed from the inheritance years before the question of inheritance arose. I looked at the papers. My name, my grandfather's name, my grandmother's name, the address of Aldenvale, the parcel number I had memorized one summer when Bernard was showing me the property boundaries, and the old iron stake markers he'd hammered in himself along the fence lines. I looked at the date the trust had been filed, 6 years before Bernard's death. He had been 63. He had been in good health. He had done this not under the pressure of illness or urgency, but with the calm, forward-looking deliberateness of a farmer who plants trees whose fruit he knows he will not live to pick. Claire said, in the particular tone of someone delivering information they want to be received accurately, that there was a reason Bernard had chosen an irrevocable trust rather than a simple will. She said he had been very clear about his concerns. He had told her, with the directness of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at a position he is comfortable with, that his sons were good men in many respects, but that they did not see Aldenvale the way he saw it, and that if it passed to them directly, it would be sold before he was cold. She said he had used those words, "before I was cold." Then he had folded his hands on the table in her office and told her to build something that would hold, and she had built it. I asked whether my father could contest the trust. She said yes, but that contesting an irrevocable trust established by a person of sound mind, with full legal capacity, witnessed and notarized and recorded, and operating for 6 years prior to the grantor's death, was an exercise with extremely limited prospects of success and extremely unlimited prospects of expense. She said the kind of legal challenge that might be mounted would cost considerably more than my father's share of the sale proceeds, and would take years, and would almost certainly fail. She said she had designed the documents with this specific possibility in mind, because Bernard had specifically asked her to. He had told her that his son Dennis was a practical man, and that if the practical analysis pointed clearly in one direction, Dennis would eventually go that direction. She had designed the trust to make the practical analysis clear. There was also, she said, a letter. She handed me a sealed envelope, my name in Bernard's handwriting, in the thick, deliberate strokes of a man who had worked with his hands all his life, and whose grip, even on a pen, had a particular quality. She said he had left it in her keeping and asked that it be given to me after I'd had time to understand the trust fully. She left the room to take a call and closed the door behind her, and I sat with the envelope for a long moment before I opened it. The letter was 2 pages and a few lines. Not long by the standards of letters, but Bernard had never been a man who wasted words, and the density of meaning in what he had written was considerable. He had written it in the winter before he died, he said at the beginning, not because he expected to die soon, but because he had learned from the land that the time to prepare for the hard frost is before the frost comes, not during it. He wrote about the orchard, about the specific trees he loved, about what each season demanded and what it gave back. He wrote about Edith briefly in a way that contained a whole marriage in a few sentences. He wrote about my father and uncle with a fairness that was clearly painful. He said he loved his sons, that he understood how they had become who they were, that he did not blame them for not seeing what he saw in Aldenvale, because seeing what he saw had required 40 years of daily attention, and he could not give them those years. He said the saddest distance between people is the one that grows from seeing the same thing differently, and that he had made peace with this distance. Then he wrote about me, about the summers, about the specific things he had noticed in me that had led him to his decision. Not just the love for the farm, which he said could have been sentiment, but the specific quality of attention I paid to it, the questions I asked, the fact that I learned the names of the trees before I learned the varieties, because I understood that the individual tree was more important than the category. He wrote about the summer when I was 13, and I had noticed before he had that the older Bramley in the northwest corner was showing early signs of a fungal problem that he had then treated in time to save the tree. He said that was the moment he was certain. He said I had not been looking for the problem. I had simply been paying the kind of attention that notices problems as a byproduct of noticing everything. He closed the letter with 3 sentences. The first said the farm had always been more mine than his son's, because belonging is about care and not blood. The second said that Edith was the one who had thought of hiding the card where I would find it, and that she had been right that I was the one who would be cleaning the closets, and that this was exactly the kind of quiet, practical genius he had loved her for across 46 years. The third sentence said, "Take care of the old man Russet." He'll outlast all of us if someone remembers to. I sat in Claire Moreau's office with that letter for a long time. When I came back to Hartwick, I said nothing about what I'd learned. This was one of the harder disciplines of the months that followed, maintaining the ordinary surface of things while understanding that the ordinary surface was not the whole picture. My father continued his dinner table presentations about Aldenvale. My uncle continued his Sunday appearances. I continued saying I was still thinking about it, and my father continued receiving this with the patience of a man who expects the other person to arrive eventually at the conclusion he has already reached. He was not wrong that I would arrive at a conclusion. He was wrong about which one. I went to Claire's office twice more over the following months. The first time to review the acceptance process in detail, so that I understood exactly what happened and in what order and what my role in it was. The second time, 2 months before my birthday, because something had changed. What had changed was Raymond. Not the fact of Raymond's scheming, which I had known about in general terms for some time, but its specific pace. I had come back from Aldenvale on a Saturday afternoon in February to find a business card on the kitchen counter. Harwick Green Development, a name I recognised from my father's conversations. My father was out. My mother was upstairs. The card had my father's handwriting on the back. A date and a time, 2 weeks hence. I photographed it with my phone and put it back where I found it and went upstairs. I called Claire that evening and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment. She said she had received a call that week from the County Land Records Office, indicating that an inquiry had been made about the title status of the Aldenvale parcel. Someone had been checking. She said this was consistent with due diligence by a developer, but it was also consistent with someone attempting to verify whether a clear title could be established before filing a transfer document. She said we should move forward with preparation on an accelerated basis, that the closer my birthday got, the more important it was that we were ready to act on the morning of the day itself. She also said something that I've thought about many times since. She said that Bernard had anticipated this, that one of the specific scenarios he had discussed with her when establishing the trust was the possibility that his sons would attempt to use the period between Edith's death and my 18th birthday, the period when I was a minor and the farm's true ownership might not be widely known, to create what she called a cloud on title. A forged or unauthorized transfer document filed against a property doesn't transfer real ownership, but it creates a legal complication that can take time and money to clear. Bernard had asked her to design the trust in a way that made such a filing as difficult as possible, and as visible as possible the moment it was attempted. She had done this. The irrevocable trust, recorded at the county office 6 years prior, created a chain of title that was clear and public. Any subsequent filing that conflicted with it would be immediately visible in the records and immediately referable to her as trustee. She had also taken an additional precaution, at her own initiative, that she told me about on this second visit. She had a contact at the County Land Records Office who had agreed, informally, to notify her if any document was submitted against the Aldenvale parcel in the weeks before my birthday. She said Bernard had paid her to do a job, and she intended to do it completely. I went home that evening and sat with my homework at the kitchen table, while my father moved around the house doing the ordinary things of an ordinary evening. And I thought about the specific fact of my grandfather building a protection for me before I was old enough to need it. Before my father had done anything wrong. Before the problem he was designing against had even fully formed. Patience isn't weakness, I imagined him saying. It's timing. Bernard said things like this. They sounded general, but they were always specific. 6 weeks before my birthday, Raymond came for Sunday dinner and afterward followed my father into the study. I was doing homework at the kitchen table and could hear their voices through the wall, lower and faster than they usually spoke, with the quality of people moving through a plan that has acquired momentum. I couldn't hear the words clearly enough to be certain of them, but I heard a number, 400 and something, and I heard the word contingent, and I heard Raymond say something about timing, and my father say something about the papers, and then it went quieter, and I went back to my homework. I texted Claire that night. I think they've signed something. She replied within minutes. I'll check Monday. She confirmed by Tuesday that Harwick Green Development had registered a preliminary agreement for the purchase of the Aldenvale parcel at $430,000, with the agreement conditional on delivery of a clear title within 45 days of the signing date. Raymond had signed it, not my father, which told me that my father was maintaining a certain distance from the specific mechanism, though not from the outcome. Raymond had signed a preliminary agreement to sell property he did not own and had never owned, which was either extreme confidence or extreme carelessness, and in Raymond's case, I suspected it was both. Claire said this was actually useful. She said that a preliminary agreement signed by someone with no legal authority to sell is not binding on the property, but that it was evidence of intent and potentially of fraud if Raymond had represented himself to the developer as having authority he lacked. She said she had preserved a copy of the county title records as they stood at the time of the signing, and that these records clearly showed the trust, and that this would be relevant if the matter became a legal dispute, which she thought it might. She said I should continue as planned. 11 more days. The trust could not be touched until I was 18, but neither could it be dissolved by anyone except me, and I had no intention of dissolving it. The dinner conversation 4 days before my birthday was the most direct one we'd had. My father sat across from me, and my mother sat at the end of the table as she always did, and the three of us ate a meal my mother had made carefully, and my father spoke to me in the measured tone he used for important subjects. He said that the Harwick Green conversation had moved further than he'd indicated, and that there was a timeline involved, and that he needed me to understand that this was not a situation where unlimited deliberation was available. He said the developer was serious and had a preferred closing window, and that if we didn't act within that window, the opportunity might close. He said all of this as though I were a business partner being briefed, rather than a daughter being informed, and I recognized, with the clarity that sometimes comes from understanding a situation fully, that this was actually how he thought of the situation. I said I was still thinking about it. My father looked at me with the first edges of frustration visible around the patient expression. He said he didn't want to put pressure on me, but that there were financial considerations that affected the family, that his business had had a difficult few years, and that the proceeds from Aldenvale would address certain obligations that were currently causing him considerable stress, and that he hoped I could understand that the practical well-being of the people in my life was a relevant factor in this decision. My mother looked at the table. I looked at my father and thought about Bernard and the stone wall and the patience of a man who had planted this exact protection years before it was needed. I said I understood and that I would give him my answer soon. My father nodded with the nod of someone who has decided the answer is already decided. He was not entirely wrong. The answer was already decided. He just didn't know what it was. The night before my birthday, I drove to Aldenvale alone, the road I had taken dozens of times across 9 years, the turn at the old milk cooperative building, the long slope down toward the valley, the way the farm appears at the bottom of the hill with the orchard behind it and the slope above. This road had become mine in the most literal possible sense, the sense of being held in the body, the way only things you've travelled repeatedly can be held. And driving it that night, I felt the particular quality of something that is about to change in the way it needs to change. I parked in the gravel beside the house. The April night was cold and clear, and the orchard was dark against the sky, the trees just beginning to show the first suggestions of blossom. Early this year, which meant a good summer if the late frosts held off, which was always the gamble in this valley, and always worth making. I walked the rows for a while before I went inside. Not long, just enough. The old man russet at the top, bare still while the younger trees were budding, taking its time as it always did, as though it understood that its strength was in not being rushed. I stood beside it for a moment and put my hand on the bark, which was rough and ridged and cold, and I thought about Bernard. Inside, I made tea in Edith's kitchen with Edith's kettle, and I sat at the table Bernard had built the year they got married, which was still solid and still level after 46 years because he had built it to last. And I opened my laptop and connected to the video call with Claire. She appeared in her home office, composed and professional even at 11:30 at night, because she had understood when she agreed to this process that it would require this kind of commitment, and she had committed without complaint. We talked through the documents one final time, the acceptance of beneficiary form, which formally transferred the trust's management from Edith's designated successor trustee to me as the primary beneficiary upon my reaching majority. The beneficiary designation confirmation, which established my legal authority over all decisions relating to the trust's assets. Claire had prepared everything with tabs and annotations, the professional thoroughness of someone who has thought through the things that could go wrong and designed against them. At midnight, the clock on my laptop rolled over and Claire said, "Happy birthday, Nadia." I signed the documents. My name, on the line below Bernard's and Edith's, the continuation of something that had been building for years before I was old enough to understand it was being built for me. Claire said she would be at the county records office when it opened at 8. She said to try to sleep. I stayed at the farm that night. I wasn't certain I would sleep, and I was right. But I lay in the bed in the back room with the window open slightly, and the cold spring air coming in with the smell of the orchard. And I listened to the sounds a farm makes at night. The wind in the trees, the occasional settling of the old house, the faint sound of the creek that ran along the northern property boundary. And I thought about Bernard at 32, walking these 42 acres for the first time as the man who owned them, trying to understand what they were and what they needed, and what he could give them in exchange for what they would give him. I thought about him at 69, sitting across from Claire in her Charter Street office, clear-eyed and practical, and building a shelter for someone who didn't yet know she needed one. I drove home before 6 to be there when my parents woke. I ate breakfast at the kitchen table and drank coffee that I made myself and waited. My father came downstairs at 7:30 in his work clothes and looked surprised to see me up and said good morning with the slightly elaborate warmth of a man who has decided to be in a good mood today, because today is going to be a good day. Raymond arrived at 8:15. I heard his car in the driveway and my father went to the door and they spoke briefly in the hallway in low voices. I heard Raymond say something about the records office and my father say the opener. They came through the kitchen. Raymond was wearing his good jacket. My father had a folder. Raymond nodded at me with the particular nod of someone who has decided I am a detail that will be managed. They left together at 8:25. I cleared my cereal bowl. I washed it. I dried it. I put it away. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. Claire called at 8:40. Her voice had the quality of someone delivering information they have been looking forward to delivering. She said, "It's recorded. The Liz Pendens is on the file. Anyone who pulls the Aldenvale parcel from this point forward sees the trust, sees my name as trustee, sees my name as beneficiary." She said the property record was clean and visible and public, and that anyone who filed a conflicting document would be filing against a clear chain of title that had existed for 6 years, and that no clerk in any county office in the state was going to record over. At 8:53, she called again. Her voice had a different quality this time, the quality of someone containing something. She said they had arrived at 8:47. She described what happened in the precise way that witnesses describe things when they are being careful to be accurate. Raymond had approached the counter and placed a document on it. A deed transfer form, prepared by himself, signed by himself, notarized with what she had reason to believe was not a legitimate notary stamp, transferring the Aldenvale property from the estate of Bernard and Edith Colm to himself and my father as heirs. The clerk had taken the document, typed the parcel number, looked at the screen, typed again, and then looked up and said she was unable to record it because the property had been held in the Aldenvale Irrevocable Trust for 6 years, and furthermore that a Liz Pendens had been recorded against it that morning. She said the chain of title did not support the filing and that she would recommend they speak with an attorney. Raymond had said, Claire told me, that there must be a mistake, that his parents had owned that property. The clerk had said the title record was clear and that the trust had been established and recorded in 2019, and that if he wished to dispute the record, he was welcome to contact the trustee, whose name was Claire Moreau. At the mention of Claire's name, Raymond had placed both hands flat on the counter. He had turned to my father. My father had stared at Raymond for a long moment without speaking. Then my father had said something that Claire, sitting across the waiting room, could not hear, but whose tone she described as quiet and cold. They had left. She said, "I think your father is going to call you." I said, "I know." She said, "Whatever he says, the position is solid. There is nothing he can do to change what is in the county record today." I said, "I know." She said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm okay." I meant it, and I didn't mean it, simultaneously. My father called at 9:15. He did not say good morning. He said my name, and then he said, "What did you do?" with a flatness in his voice that was not entirely anger and not entirely grief, and was the sound of a man standing in a parking lot, having just discovered that the story he'd been telling himself for the past 2 years was built on a foundation that wasn't there. I told him what I had done. I told him about the trust, about Claire, about the morning's filing. I told him that the farm had been held in the trust since I was 12 years old, that Bernard had established it before I was even a teenager, that it had never been part of either of my grandparents' estates and had never been available for inheritance by his or Raymond's or anyone else's. I told him this calmly and sequentially, in the way that Claire had told me, because that was the right way to deliver difficult information, and because it was what Bernard would have done. My father said that was impossible, that his parents had owned that property, that he was their son and had a right to know if they'd done something like this. I said they had owned it, and then they had put it in trust, and that was within their complete legal authority, and that the trust had been designed specifically so that it could not be overturned, and that Claire had made this very clear, and that he was welcome to seek his own legal advice on this point, which would confirm what she had already said. There was a silence that had a particular quality to it. I counted through it. My father said, in a voice that had shifted from flat to something more complicated, "Your grandfather put you up to this." I said, "Grandpa planned it. I didn't have to be put up to it. He planned it because he knew you." That was the sentence I had not planned to say, and that came out anyway, because it was the true sentence. And I had made a commitment to myself, sitting in Bernard's study at 16 with Edith's envelope in my hands, that whatever happened, I would not lie about what was true. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest one. Eventually, my father said he would speak to a lawyer. I said that was his right, and that Claire had explained what the legal landscape looked like, and that I hoped the conversation with a lawyer would be useful to him. He hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that call. My mother came downstairs at some point and looked at me and then at her phone, which was showing missed calls from my father, and her face went through several things in quick succession. She sat down across from me. I told her briefly what had happened. She listened in the way my mother listens, with a face that is trying very hard not to show what it is feeling, and not entirely succeeding. She said, "Did you know all along?" I said I'd found out about 14 months ago. She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I said, "Because if I had, there would have been a different kind of fight. And Grandpa had already handled the important parts, and adding a fight to it wouldn't have helped anyone." My mother looked at me for a long time. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she'd known the farm wasn't theirs to take. In some part of herself she hadn't let herself listen to. She said she hadn't said this to my father because there was a version of events she'd found it easier to believe, and that she understood now that easier wasn't the same as right. She said this to the table rather than to me, and I received it in the spirit it was offered. Raymond called the house that afternoon. My father took the call in the study, and I sat in the kitchen and heard the muffled rise and fall of a conversation that was not going well. When my father came out, his face had the specific look of a man who has just finished being angry on behalf of someone who has demonstrated they do not deserve his anger. He said that Raymond had misrepresented the situation, that he had not done the title search a licensed real estate professional should have done before entering into a preliminary agreement, that he had signed a document with a developer without having confirmed that what he was signing was legally supportable, and that the consequences of this were Raymond's to deal with. I asked what the developer had said. My father said he didn't know yet, but that Raymond was handling it and that he, my father, was not going to be part of whatever Raymond was handling because he had not signed anything and was not going to sign anything, and that this conversation was one he needed to stop having. What happened with Raymond in the weeks that followed arrived in pieces, some from Claire and some from the natural information network of a small town where people who know the same people tend to learn the same things eventually. Harwick Green Development invoked the penalty clause in the preliminary agreement and sought the earnest deposit Raymond had apparently put forward as a gesture of good faith, along with additional damages for the misrepresentation of title. Raymond's real estate license was flagged by the state regulatory body pending an investigation into the unauthorized transfer document and the notary stamp, which turned out, as Claire had suspected, to not match any notary registered in our county. The investigation moved slowly, as these things do, but it moved. Raymond retained a lawyer who told him, as Claire had predicted, that contesting the irrevocable trust would cost more than any realistic recovery and would almost certainly fail. The lawyer advised him to focus on limiting his exposure with Harwick Green. My father did not contest the trust. He found a lawyer who confirmed what Claire had said and then called her directly, which was, Claire told me later, a sign that he was at least beginning to think practically again, and that she had found him, in that call, more willing to listen than she had expected. He did not challenge the trust documents he accepted, with the difficulty that proud men have accepting things that prove them wrong about what they thought they knew, that the farm had never been his to sell, and that his parents had made a decision he disagreed with, and that was nonetheless their decision to make. There was one conversation I need to tell you about, because it was the most important one. 2 weeks after the birthday, my father came to Aldenvale. He called first, which he had not done before, and I said yes, come. He arrived on a Saturday morning in the truck he'd had for 10 years, and he parked in the gravel and sat in the driver's seat for a while before he got out. And when he came up the porch steps, he was carrying a bottle of cider from the Hartwick Farmers Market, and he looked like a man who had been sitting with something for 2 weeks and had not yet found a place to put it down. We sat on the porch. He poured cider into 2 glasses that I brought from the kitchen. The orchard was in early blossom now, the trees white and pink in the morning light. The specific smell of apple blossom that I had known since I was 9 and that I could not describe to anyone who hadn't known it themselves. My father looked at it for a long time. I waited. He said he hadn't understood what his parents had built here. He said this not as an excuse and not as an apology, but as a plain statement, the way he stated things when he'd given them sufficient thought to arrive at the plain version. He said he had seen the farm as labour, and the labour as something that consumed his father's attention, and that therefore the farm and his father's attention had always been competing things in his memory, and that this wasn't fair to the farm or to his father, but that it was true, and that he was trying to be honest with me about it. He said he had been surprised, in the 2 weeks since the birthday, by how much he had thought about his father. Not about the trust or the money, or the disappointment of the sale that wasn't happening, but about Bernard himself, about specific things he remembered, about the kind of man his father had been, and about the ways in which he had failed to fully know that man while he was alive. I didn't say anything for a while after he said this. Then I said that Bernard had known this too, that the letter he'd left me said he loved his sons and understood why they couldn't see what he saw in the farm, and that he didn't blame them, and that the decision he'd made wasn't a punishment or a judgment, but a provision. The same kind of provision he made every autumn, working against the future to make sure the things that mattered would survive the winter. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he always thought 10 years ahead. I said, yes. He said, I never understood how he did that. I said, I'm still figuring it out. We sat there on the porch through most of the morning. We didn't resolve everything. There was too much to resolve in a single morning, and I understood that resolution, where it came, would come the way orchards come into fruit, slowly, over seasons, not all at once. But my father walked the orchard with me before he left, which he had never done, and I showed him the trees by name. And when I took him to the old man russet at the top of the slope and told him Bernard had called it that, he put his hand on the bark the same way I had on my birthday eve, and he was quiet for a moment, in a way that had something in it that I recognized as the beginning of understanding, even if it was only the beginning. He left in the early afternoon. I watched his truck go down the lane and turn onto the road and disappear behind the hill. Then I walked back to the porch and sat in the chair that was mine now, in the way that Bernard had said things were mine, by virtue of the knowledge held and the care given. And I looked out at the orchard in its full early blossom and thought about the people who had planted it. My sister Penny came to Aldenvale for the first time in June. She was 13, and she came with the slightly defensive casualness of a teenager who is curious but doesn't want to appear too curious. and she stood in the kitchen looking around with the evaluating attention of someone deciding whether this is a place she wants to be. I made her tea and showed her the house, and then took her outside into the orchard, and she walked the rows beside me without saying much. And when we reached the old man russet, she stopped and looked at it the way I had always stopped and looked at it, with the specific quality of attention that certain things demand, and that you can't entirely explain to someone who doesn't feel it. She asked about the tree. I told her what Bernard had told me: the variety, the age, the particular rhythm of its fruiting, the way it needed more time than the others in spring because it had learned patience across many decades of springs and didn't feel the need to rush. Penny listened with the attention that I was beginning to understand was its own kind of inheritance. The attention that had skipped my father and found its way to me, and might, with time and opportunity, find its way to her too. She asked if she could come back. I said any time. She nodded, picking at the bark of the stone wall the way I had picked at it when I was 9. And then she asked whether the apples from this tree were good, and I said the best on the farm, and she said in that case, she was definitely coming back. I enrolled in agricultural science at the regional college that autumn. This was not a decision anyone expected, including, I think, some part of me. I had grown up in Hartwick with the understanding that college meant the kind of course that led to the kind of career that involved offices and salaries, and the metrics by which success is typically measured in a small city. And agricultural science was not obviously on that path. But I had sat in Claire Moreau's office and understood that what Bernard had left me was not just a farm, but a responsibility. And responsibility, in my understanding, requires competence. And competence in this specific domain required learning the things I didn't yet know systematically, rather than only through the apprenticeship I'd had with Bernard. The drive to campus passed within 2 miles of Aldenvale. On mornings when I left early, I went to the farm first and walked the orchard before the first lecture. It felt like the right order of things. The Liss Pendens was withdrawn that autumn when Claire confirmed that no further challenges were active and that the title was clean and settled. The property record shows, to anyone who pulls it now, the Aldenvale Irrevocable Trust as sole title holder, Nadia Collum as beneficiary, Claire Moreau as trustee. Clean, no clouds, exactly as Bernard had wanted it. Claire called when the withdrawal was confirmed. She said in her measured way that the process was complete, and that Bernard had built a sound structure, and that it had held as built structures do when the person who builds them knows what they're doing. I thanked her for everything. She said she was only doing what her client had paid her to do, and then she paused and added that she had been doing this work for 25 years, and that the people who planned this carefully for the people they loved were rarer than they should be, and that it had been a privilege to see the plan work the way it was supposed to. I think about Bernard often. Not in the way you think about someone when you are still in the acute part of grief, which passes, but in the way you think about someone who has remained present in the specific form of the things they built and the choices they made, and the knowledge they planted in you across the years when you were young enough to receive it fully. I think about him when I walk the orchard, which is often, and when I read the trees the way he taught me, and when the old man russet takes its time in spring while the younger trees are already blossoming, and I watch it with the patience he taught me to have. He saw the storm before I could see it. He built the shelter before I knew I would need one. He did this not with drama or announcement, but with the quiet, methodical attention of a farmer who understands that the work done in the off-season is the work that determines the harvest, and who never expected to be thanked for it, because he was doing it for the right reason, which was love in its most practical and enduring form. Bernard couldn't make my father into a man who would have kept the farm. He couldn't make Raymond into someone who understood the difference between value and worth. He couldn't change what his sons were, any more than he could change the weather that came across the valley each winter. What he could do was make sure that what mattered had ground to stand on, literally and legally, and in every sense that counted when the winter came. He made sure, 6 years before he needed to, that the thing he loved most would still be there in the spring. The orchard is in full leaf now as I'm telling you this. It's a good year. The early blossom survived the late frost, which it always does, but which I still worry about the way Bernard always worried about. Because some things are worth worrying about, even when the odds are in your favour. The Bramley in the northwest corner is in its good year, which means next year it will sulk, which I have already planned for. The 2 copses near the lower fence needed attention to drainage in the wet spring and got it. The old man russet is doing what it does, which is to take longer than everyone else and produce something, in the end, that is worth the waiting. I walk up to the stone wall at the top of the slope sometimes in the evenings, when the light is going gold across the valley, and the farmhouse is lit from inside, and the rows of trees below have that quality of arranged abundance that orchards have in the last of the summer light. I sit on the wall where Bernard and I sat when I was 11, and I think about what he told me. And I understand it now in the complete way, rather than the partial way. Not as a poetic observation, but as the most practical thing anyone has ever said to me. A deed is a piece of paper. What you learn from a place lives in you. He was right. He was always right. He just knew that being right wasn't enough on its own. And so he also built something that would hold. Take care of what was given to you. Take care of what was trusted to you. Do the work when the work is available. Prepare in the off-season. Trust the structure if the structure was built by someone who loved you and who checked it carefully. These are the things the farm has taught me, which are also the things Bernard taught me, which are the same things. They're the same things.